Alright guys, this is it, the last video in the Cold War, and we are talking about the fall of the Soviet Union. In the last video we talked about the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev and his new reforms like perestroika, which is restructuring, economic restructuring, and glasnost, which was openness, and now we're going to put the final nails in the coffin of the Soviet Union. So in a previous video we talked about the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. These were negotiations which were meant to limit and maybe even reduce the number of nuclear weapons both the United States and the Soviet Union have. And these type of agreements are going to be more likely under Gorbachev. And what we're going to see is Gorbachev is going to find kind of a willing partner in these negotiations in the new President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who was elected back in 1980. So Reagan, for his first term, he basically had to deal with first Brezhnev and then Andropov and Chernenko, those older leaders who died off. It's really only in his second term he gets a chance to negotiate with Mikhail Gorbachev, and Gorbachev was very open to talking about arms reduction because from Gorbachev's perspective, the Soviet economy simply could not afford this arms race any longer, right? They're a poor country, really, compared to the United States in terms of just sheer, purchasing power. They can't afford the nuclear weapons and the tanks and the ships and the submarine. They just can't compared to America. Now, all these big changes going on in the Soviet Union, you could argue maybe they're too much too quickly for the Soviet Union to withstand. And so these reforms that Gorbachev had brought out there, they're going to lead to instability. Now, think about glasnost, or openness. People were encouraged to think and talk openly and, even criticize the government. And people had not been able to do this for generations in the Soviet Union, and that desire for freedom is intoxicating, and it's going to lead to more and more demand for freedom and more demand for political freedom. In other words, real, true democracy, not just the Soviet communist government. Now, another underlying issue with the Soviet Union is our old friend nationalism. It's tempting to think of the Soviet Union as just this big Russian country. That is not the case. The Russians may be the majority of the people in the Soviet Union, but there are lots of ethnic minorities, right? You've got Ukrainians, you have Kazakhs, Georgian, Armenians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, the list can go on. And so these groups, their desire to be, away from and basically independent of the Soviet Union was growing with these new reforms. And so the question was, which one of these individual republics might test the waters first and try to break away? And it's not going to be one of the big ones. It's actually a very small one called Lithuania. Lithuania is kind of like right up here in the Baltic Sea. So little Lithuania right here in March of 1990, declares its independence from the Soviet Union. Gorbachev said, well, no, you can't do that. And so he orders an economic blockade of the Soviet Union, hoping to basically kind of strangle the Lithuanians economically into having no choice but to return to the Soviet Union. That's the plan. Lithuanian people, however, are ready for independence, and they're not going to be easily intimidated by the Soviet Union. Here they are, having torn down the statue of Vladimir Lenin. Now, the danger of Lithuania having its independence, of course, is the domino theory. If you have one republic of the Soviet Union declare independence, what's stopping all the others from doing the same thing? And so Gorbachev didn't want to use force necessarily, but he also realized you just can't let Lithuania go. Like that'll just be one before all the rest. So we have to stop them. And the tension rises to the point of January 1991 when violence does erupt. Soviet soldiers kill 14 unarmed civilians and wound hundreds others in the capital of Lithuania. So now we have Lithuanian people being basically killed by the Soviet army. This outbreak of violence triggered huge protests back in Moscow and across the Soviet Union. So the people were upset for a couple of reasons. Number one, Gorbachev had promised all this economic progress, right? With perestroika, the economy is going to bounce back and you're going to have more money in your pocket and so forth. Well, that wasn't happening. Okay, the economy was not growing the way he thought that he kind of advertised it would. They're also upset about the fact that, Lithuanian people were considered Soviet citizens and they're being gunned down by the Soviet military. That, who's to stop the Soviet military from doing that to people in Moscow or across the Russian part of the Soviet Union? So people are frankly very, very upset. And into this void of confusion rises a politician named Boris Yeltsin. Now, Yeltsin had been, kind of an up-and-coming leader of this in the Soviet Communist Party, and he's also very much an ambitious man, an opportunist, you might even call him. And he criticizes Gorbachev's leadership. He criticizes the attack on Lithuania. He criticizes the slow pace of economic and political reforms. And he becomes a big thorn in Gorbachev's side. And this is all going to culminate in 1991 with something called a coup. Now, if you've forgotten what a coup is short for coup d'etat, which in French means to basically strike a blow against the state. In this case, what a coup simply is when a group tries to seize power from the official government of a country. Now, this could be the military leading a coup, it could be the people leading a coup, could be people within the government, against a different faction, whatever. In this case, in August of 1991, what happens is a group of hardline conservatives who felt that the Soviet Union was basically straying way far away from its original communist path, and deciding that Gorbachev was dangerous, decided to overthrow him. So they are going to announce that the military is now in charge and Gorbachev is pushed aside. So on August 18th, 1991, Gorbachev is basically put under house arrest. The army demands that he resigns. The very next day, these coup plotters and leaders decide to send out tanks into the streets of Moscow. And this was supposed to be a show of force to say, hey, we're in charge here. But think historically how interesting and ironic this is. The Soviets had sent tanks into Hungary in 1956 to force the Hungarians back into communism. They'd sent the tanks in again in 1968 into Czechoslovakia to force the Czech people back into communism. And now Soviet tanks are not being used in a foreign country, but in their own country, in their own capital, as a show of, we're in charge. But of course, if you're having to do this in your own capital, this really shows how weak your grasp actually is. And at this moment, Boris Yeltsin does something very famous. He goes down to where the soldiers are there patrolling the streets and so forth, and he climbs atop one of these tanks. He's right in front of the Parliament building. He climbs on one of these tanks, and he tells the people of Russia to rise up with him in opposition to this coup, that we can't let the military take away the reforms and freedoms that we have gained in the last couple of years. We can't go back, and we can't let them win. So stand up to the coup. Now, if you look, there's Boris Yeltsin. Again, he's standing on a tank in defiance of the coup. If you look behind him over here, something very interesting. That is not the Soviet flag, of course. That is the flag of Russia. And this is, I think, very telling that the Soviet Union is basically really on its final days here. And people are already looking to the future where Russia would be a country separate from the Soviet Union. So, do the people respond? Well, yes, they did. They are out, taking direct action, building barricades. You can see in the top here, confronting the military very directly. I especially like the old lady here climbing on the armored personnel carrier. Then, but how far can that go? Will the soldiers open fire on the protesters? That's the big question, because think of how many times we've seen uprisings in the past, and we've talked about this in history so many times. Will the protesters be gunned down, or will the soldiers step aside? And in this case, what's going to happen is the soldiers are going to refuse to fire or refuse to attack the Parliament building. And when the military doesn't follow orders, basically the strength of the coup fizzles out, and this is kind of the end, literally. There is Gorbachev looking at the shattered hammer and sickle, the symbol of communism in the Soviet Union itself. So Gorbachev is let out of house arrest. He resigns as the party leader of the of the communist government, anyways. And you can see him here, basically resigning. And in early December 1991, all the 15 republics of the Soviet Union had declared independence. And with all the individual pieces of the Soviet Union declaring independence, there's no point even keeping the Soviet Union around. And on December 25th, 1991, the Soviet Union comes to an official end. That is, of course, Christmas Day. You can see the Soviet flag being lowered for the last time, and that is it, right? And this political cartoon is really telling. It's a very interesting take. There's communism, of course, is dead, right? And there's Gorbachev leading the funeral procession. And up here in the communist paradise, we have Lenin and Stalin, and they just can't believe their eyes, right? They can't believe what's happened to the country they built. And at top, this is Karl Marx, who's considered kind of the founder, the philosophical founder of communist theory. And this is kind of the new normal, right? The Soviet Union has collapsed, and that's the end. And this is, for you guys who didn't live through the Cold War, and I only lived through the tail end of it, it's kind of easy to overlook this, think, okay, whatever, statues, it's over. This was a big deal, because think of all the baggage that came with the Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation, the massive military spending, just the paranoia and so forth. Well, all that's gone, and just the blink of an eye. It happened so quickly and so unexpectedly, and the Cold War is finally over.